The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked earth as Jake Morrison stood on the porch of what could generously be called a cabin. The structure leaned to one side like a drunk cowpoke after a long night at the saloon, and the roof had more holes than a target after shooting practice. But it was his now, all 40 acres of it, purchased for the princely sum of $50 from a man so eager to be rid of the place he'd practically thrown the deed at Jake's chest. Jake pulled the crumpled paper from his vest pocket and read it again, though he'd memorized every word. Worthless scrubland, the previous owner, Ezra Blackwood, had called it. Ain't nothing there but rattlesnakes and regret. The old man had cackled at his own joke, pocketed Jake's money, and disappeared into the desert on a horse that looked as worn as its rider. That had been 3 days ago, and Jake was beginning to wonder if Blackwood hadn't gotten the better end of the deal. The well was dry as a preacher's sermon, the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and the town of Cedar Gulch was a hard day's ride through country that would test the mettle of any man. But Jake Morrison had been tested before, and he'd come out the other side with scars and stories to prove it. He'd spent the last of his savings on this place, driven by desperation and the kind of hope that only a broke man could muster. 3 years of working cattle drives had left him with enough money to buy a small spread. But when he'd arrived in Cedar Gulch, the prices for decent land had been far beyond his reach. The town was booming, they said, with the railroad coming through and silver mines opening up in the hills. Everything was for sale, but nothing was for sale cheap. Except for this place. Jake walked to the edge of the porch and surveyed his domain. The land stretched out in rolling hills covered with scrub brush and Joshua trees, broken by dry washes and rocky outcroppings. It wasn't much to look at, but it was his, and that meant something to a man who'd spent most of his 35 years working other people's cattle on other people's land. A movement in the distance caught his eye, and he shaded his face with his hand to get a better look. A rider was approaching, kicking up a small cloud of dust in the still morning air. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Colt 45 on his hip, a habit learned from years on the trail where strangers could mean trouble. The rider turned out to be a woman, which surprised Jake more than he cared to admit. She sat her horse like she was born in the saddle, and as she drew closer, he could see she was somewhere in her 30s, with dark hair tied back under a weathered hat and eyes the color of sagebrush. Her clothes were practical. Denim pants, a cotton shirt, and boots that had seen plenty of use. "You'd be Morrison," she said, as she reined in her horse near the porch. It wasn't a question. "I am," Jake replied, keeping his voice neutral. "And you'd be?" "Sarah Whitman. I run the spread to the east of here." She gestured toward a line of hills that rose like sleeping giants from the desert floor. "Heard you bought the Blackwood place. News travels fast out here." Sarah's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. Not much else to talk about when a stranger drops $50 on land that's been sitting empty for 5 years. "Mind if I water my horse?" Jake nodded toward the well. "Help yourself, though I should warn you, the well's drier than last year's newspaper." "I know," Sarah said, dismounting with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime on horseback. "That's why I brought my own." She pulled a canvas water bag from her saddle and poured some into her hat for the horse to drink. "Question is, do you know why it's dry?" "I figure these things happen out here. Desert's not exactly known for its abundance of water." Sarah studied him with those sage-green eyes, as if trying to decide whether he was a fool or just unlucky. "The well wasn't always dry," she said finally. "Used to be the sweetest water in the territory. Blackwood's father dug it himself 40 years ago. Found water at 20 feet and never had a problem until about 5 years ago." "What happened 5 years ago?" "That's when old Ezra started acting strange. Stopped coming to town, stopped talking to his neighbors, stopped maintaining his property. Then one day the well went dry, and he started telling everyone the land was cursed. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Cursed? Ezra's words, not mine. But I'll tell you this, I've been ranching in this territory for 15 years, and I've never seen a well just up and quit for no reason. Water table's still good everywhere else around here. The woman mounted her horse with the same easy grace she'd shown dismounting. Word of advice, Morrison. You might want to take a closer look at what you bought before you get too settled. Some secrets have a way of staying buried until someone comes along who's fool enough to dig them up. With that cryptic warning, Sarah Whitman spurred her horse and rode off toward the eastern hills, leaving Jake standing on his sagging porch with more questions than answers. He watched until she was just a speck on the horizon, then turned his attention back to the dry well. It was a substantial structure, built from local stone and mortar, with a wooden windlass that had seen better days. Jake lowered the bucket and heard it hit bottom with a hollow thud that echoed up from the depths. 20 feet, Sarah had said. Not particularly deep for a desert well, but deep enough if you hit the right spot. He spent the rest of the morning exploring his property, walking the boundaries and getting a feel for the land. It was rough country, but not impossible. With some work and a lot of luck, a man might be able to run a small herd of cattle here, assuming he could solve the water problem. The afternoon sun was beating down mercilessly when Jake decided to take another look at the well. Something Sarah had said kept nagging at him. The part about the water table being good everywhere else. If that was true, then something had to have happened to block or divert the water source. He examined the stones around the rim of the well more carefully this time, looking for any sign of recent work. Most of the mortar was old and weather-beaten, but near the base he found something that made him stop and take a closer look. Several of the stones had been removed and replaced, and the mortar holding them was noticeably newer than the rest. Jake felt his heart begin to beat faster. Someone had been tampering with the well, and given what Sarah had told him about the timing, it had probably been Ezra Blackwood himself. But why would a man sabotage his own water source? The sun was setting by the time Jake had pried loose the newer stones. What he found underneath made him forget all about his aching back and sunburned shoulders. The stones had been concealing a small cavity in the well wall, and wedged into that cavity was a leather pouch, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth. With trembling fingers, Jake unwrapped the pouch and spilled its contents into his palm. Gold coins caught the last rays of sunlight, winking like fallen stars. $20 gold pieces, more than he'd ever seen in one place. He counted them twice, hardly believing what he was seeing. 50 coins, worth $1,000, 20 times what he'd paid for the entire property. But that wasn't all. Wrapped around the coins was a piece of paper covered with Ezra Blackwood's spidery handwriting. Jake held it up to catch the dying light and read, "To whoever finds this, I pray it ain't those murderin' bastards who killed my boy. The mine's played out, but there's more where this came from. Look for the lightning tree where the old trail splits. What's buried there will set a man up for life. But beware, them that killed Tommy are still looking for it. Trust no one in town. The sheriff's in their pocket, and they got eyes everywhere. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead, but maybe you can succeed where I failed. Get justice for my boy, and the gold is yours. E. Blackwood." Jake's hands shook as he folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket along with the coins. Tommy Blackwood. He remembered hearing that name in town. The bartender at the Silver Dollar had mentioned something about Ezra's son dying in a mining accident a few years back. But according to this note, it hadn't been an accident at all. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd stumbled into something much bigger than a simple land purchase. Somewhere out there, probably not far from where he stood, was a fortune in gold that men had killed for. and now he was the only one who knew where to look for it. As the last light faded from the western sky, Jake Morrison realized that his $50 investment had just become the most dangerous purchase of his life. Jake spent a restless night in the lean-in cabin, starting at every sound the desert wind carried across his property. The gold coins felt heavy in his pocket, and Ezra's note seemed to burn against his chest where he'd tucked it inside his shirt. By the time the sun rose, he'd made his decision. He had to find the lightning tree. After a meager breakfast of beans and hardtack, Jake saddled his horse and set out to explore the boundaries of his land more thoroughly. He was looking for an old trail that split somewhere near a distinctive tree, probably one that had been struck by lightning and bore the scars to prove it. The search took most of the morning. The desert was full of dead and twisted trees, each one shaped by years of harsh wind and occasional violent storms. But finally, near the northern edge of his property, Jake found what he was looking for. The tree stood alone on a small rise, its trunk split nearly in half by some long-ago lightning strike. One half had died and turned gray as bone, while the other half still clung to life, sporting a few hardy branches with sparse green leaves. At the base of the tree, two faint paths diverged, barely visible tracks that might once have been a proper trail but had been reclaimed by the desert over the years. Jake dismounted and began to search the area methodically, looking for any sign of disturbance. The ground was hard-packed earth mixed with rocks and scrub, not the kind of soil that would show recent digging easily. But Ezra's note had mentioned something buried, which meant Jake needed to think like a man trying to hide something valuable. He was examining the base of the lightning tree when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun as he turned to face the newcomers. 3 men rode up the slope toward him, their faces shadowed by hat brims, but their intentions clear in the way they spread out in a loose semicircle as they approached. The man in the center was older than his companions, somewhere in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes. He wore a badge on his vest that caught the morning sunlight, the sheriff's star that Ezra's note had warned him about. "Mornin', Morrison," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Name's Burke, Sheriff Tom Burke. These here are my deputies, Collins and Wade." Jake nodded, but didn't relax his stance. "Sheriff, something I can do for you?" "Just thought we'd ride out and welcome you to our little corner of the territory. It's not often we get new folks settling on the Blackwood place." Burke's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you paid cash for the property. That's unusual for a cowpoke." "I saved my money." "Must have saved a considerable amount to interest old Ezra. He turned down higher offers from more established members of the community." One of the deputies, a thin man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "Sheriff, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Collins," Burke snapped, never taking his eyes off Jake. "Now then, Morrison, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what exactly are your plans for this place? It's not exactly prime cattle country." Jake could feel the tension ratcheting up with each word. These men hadn't ridden all the way out here just to welcome him to the neighborhood. "I figure to make it work somehow. Man can accomplish a lot with determination and hard work." Burke laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Determination's a fine thing, but this particular piece of ground has a way of disappointing folks. Old Ezra found that out the hard way." "What happened to Ezra?" "Found him at the bottom of Devil's Canyon 3 weeks ago. Terrible accident. Horse must have spooked and gone over the edge." Burke's tone suggested the matter was closed, which brings me to why we're here. Ezra left some personal effects when he died. Family heirlooms mostly. Nothing of real value, but they belong to his next of kin back east. I bought the place fair and square, got the deed to prove it." "Oh, I'm not questioning the sale," Burke said smoothly. "But if you happen to come across anything that looks like it might have belonged to Ezra personally, old papers, maybe a strongbox, anything like that, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know. Save his family some heartache." The message was clear enough. Burke and his men were looking for something, and they suspected it might be on Jake's property. From the way the sheriff was staring at him, Jake got the distinct impression that his life expectancy was directly related to how cooperative he proved to be. "I'll keep that in mind," Jake said carefully. Burke studied him for a long moment, then nodded to his deputies. "Well, we'd best be getting back to town. Lots of work to do. You take care now, Morrison. This can be dangerous country for a man on his own." The three men rode away, but Jake noticed that they took their time about it, and more than once he caught one of them looking back over his shoulder. They were letting him know he was being watched. As soon as they were out of sight, Jake resumed his search around the lightning tree with renewed urgency. If Burke was already sniffing around, it meant time was running out. Whatever Ezra had buried here, Jake needed to find it before the sheriff decided to take a more direct approach. It was pure luck that led him to the discovery. His horse, tied to a scrub bush near the tree, began pawing at the ground and whinnying nervously. When Jake went to calm the animal, he noticed that the horse was standing over a patch of ground that looked different from the surrounding area, slightly more compacted, as if it had been dug up and filled in. Jake knelt and began scraping away the surface dirt with his knife. About 6 inches down, the blade struck something solid. Working more carefully now, he cleared away enough dirt to reveal the corner of a wooden box about the size of a small trunk. It took him the better part of an hour to excavate the container and pry off the lid. When he finally succeeded, Jake had to sit back on his heels and whistle softly at what he'd uncovered. The box was packed with gold nuggets, each one the size of a man's thumb or larger. There had to be 20 pounds of raw gold, maybe more, enough to buy 1,000 acres of prime ranch land or set a man up in business anywhere he chose to go. But beneath the gold, wrapped in oiled cloth, was something that made Jake's blood run cold. It was a journal, bound in cracked leather and filled with pages of careful handwriting. The first entry was dated 5 years earlier, and it told the story of Tommy Blackwood's death in brutal detail. According to the journal, Tommy hadn't died in a mining accident. He'd been murdered by Sheriff Burke and his men after discovering that they'd been stealing gold from the small claims operated by local miners. Tommy had been gathering evidence, planning to take his case to the territorial authorities when Burke learned of his investigation. The journal contained names, dates, and amounts, a complete record of the corruption that had taken root in Cedar Gulch. But more importantly, it explained why Ezra had sealed up his well and hidden this evidence. He'd been planning to expose Burke and his gang, but he'd needed time to gather more proof and figure out how to get the information to honest lawmen. The last entry in the journal was dated just 3 weeks ago, the day before Ezra's accident. It read, "They're getting suspicious. Saw Collins watching the house again yesterday. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find this and finish what Tommy started. The gold is just the beginning. Burke's been stealing from every successful claim in the territory. There's enough evidence here to hang them all." Jake closed the journal and sat back, his mind racing. He was holding enough evidence to destroy Burke and his corrupt deputies, but he was also holding his own death warrant. If Burke suspected he'd found Ezra's cache, the sheriff would stop at nothing to silence him permanently. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Jake's heart leap into his throat. He quickly shoved the journal inside his shirt and began scooping dirt back into the hole, trying to cover the remaining gold. But it was too late. 3 riders were already cresting the rise, and this time they weren't bothering with friendly conversation. Sheriff Burke reined in his horse 20 feet away, his hand resting openly on the butt of his gun. "Step away from that hole, Morrison." Jake straightened slowly, keeping his hands visible but ready to move if necessary. "Just doing a little digging. Thought I might put in a root cellar." "Don't lie to me, boy. We saw you from the ridge, and that ain't no root cellar you're digging." Burke's voice had lost all pretense of civility. "Now, I'm going to ask you one more time, nice and polite. What did you find?" "Nothing but rocks and hard dirt." Burke drew his gun in one smooth motion, the barrel centering on Jake's chest. "Collins, Wade, get down there and see what he's been digging up." The two deputies dismounted and approached the partially filled hole. It took them only moments to uncover the wooden box and reveal its golden contents. Collins whistled appreciatively while Wade began pulling out nuggets by the handful. "Well now," Burke said, his gun never wavering. "Looks like old Ezra left quite a little nest egg behind. Too bad you won't be around to spend it, Morrison. You can't just murder me in broad daylight." Burke's laugh was genuinely amused this time. "Son, you're standing on some of the most remote land in the territory. Won't be anybody finds your body for months, if ever. We'll tell folks you packed up and moved on. Happens all the time out here. Drifters come and go like tumbleweeds." Jake's mind raced, calculating distances and angles. The deputies were distracted by the gold, their attention focused on the treasure they were pulling from the wooden box. Burke was confident, maybe overconfident. It wasn't much of an advantage, but it was all Jake had. "Before you kill me," Jake said, "mind if I ask what happened to Tommy Blackwood?" Burke's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about Tommy?" "Just curious. Heard he died in a mining accident." "Tommy Blackwood was a troublemaker who stuck his nose where it didn't belong," Burke snarled. "Just like his old man. Just like you." "So you killed them both?" "Tommy fell down a mine shaft. Ezra rode his horse off a cliff. And you're about to have a tragic accident." Burke raised his gun, preparing to fire. That's when Jake made his move. Jake dove to his right, rolling behind the lightning tree, as Burke's shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark where his head had been a split second before. The deputies scrambled for their weapons, but they were still crouched by the treasure box, off balance and caught by surprise. Jake came up firing, his first shot taking Collins in the shoulder and spinning him around. His second shot missed Wade, but sent the man diving for cover behind a rocky outcropping. Burke was already spurring his horse, trying to get a clear shot around a tree trunk that sheltered Jake. "Don't just stand there," Burke shouted at his wounded deputy. "Kill him!" Collins, his left arm hanging useless at his side, managed to draw his gun with his right hand. But before he could aim, Jake put a bullet in his chest, dropping the man permanently. Wade, seeing his partner fall, broke cover and ran for his horse, abandoning the fight entirely. Burke, realizing he was now outnumbered and outgunned, tried a different approach. "Now hold on there, Morrison. Maybe we can work something out." Jake kept his gun trained on the sheriff, but didn't fire. "I'm listening." "That gold there, it's worth maybe $5,000. We could split it 50-50. You take your share and ride out of the territory. I never see you again, you never see me. Everybody wins." "What about Tommy Blackwood? What about your other victims?" Burke's face hardened. "They're dead and buried. Nothing you do is going to change that. But you're still alive, and you've got a chance to stay that way. Take the deal, son." Jake could see Wade in his peripheral vision, trying to circle around for a flanking shot. The deputy thought he was being clever, but Jake had spent years watching for cattle rustlers and horse thieves. He knew how to fight outnumbered. "There's just one problem with your offer, Burke," Jake said, keeping his voice conversational. "I found more than just gold in that box." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Jake pulled Ezra's journal from inside his shirt, holding it where Burke could see it. "Everything's in here. Names, dates, amounts. Tommy documented every crime you committed before he died. This journal could hang you and every man who's been helping you rob those miners." Burke's face went white, then red with fury. "Give me that book, Morrison." "Can't do that. See, I'm thinking the territorial marshal would be mighty interested in what Tommy Blackwood wrote down. Might even be a reward in it for the man who brings him evidence of corruption in Cedar Gulch." "You son of a—" Burke started to raise his gun, but Jake was ready for him. The two men fired simultaneously. Burke's shot went wide as his horse shied away from the sudden movement. Jake's bullet took the sheriff's center mass, punching him backward out of his saddle. Burke hit the ground hard and didn't get up. Wade, seeing his boss fall, abandoned any pretense of stealth and charged straight at Jake, firing as he ran. It was a desperate move, the kind that got men killed in gunfights. Jake took careful aim and put the deputy down with a single shot. The sudden silence that followed the gunfire was almost deafening. Jake stood among the bodies, his ears ringing and his heart pounding, hardly able to believe he was still alive. 3 men had ridden up here to kill him, and now all 3 were dead. But Jake's problems were far from over. Burke and his men would be missed eventually, and when search parties came looking for them, they'd find the bodies. Jake needed to be long gone before that happened, but he also needed to make sure the evidence against Burke reached the right people. He gathered up the journal and as much of the gold as he could carry, then mounted his horse and rode hard for the main trail that led to the territorial capital. It would be a long, dangerous journey, but it was his only chance to see justice done for Tommy Blackwood and his father. 3 days later, Jake Morrison sat in the office of Territorial Marshal Henry Colt, watching the lawman read through Tommy Blackwood's journal. The marshal was a hard-faced man in his 50s, with gray hair and pale blue eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Jake's story without interruption, occasionally asking a clarifying question, but mostly just absorbing the details. "This is quite a tale, Mr. Morrison," Marshal Colt said finally, closing the journal. "And if it's true, it represents one of the most extensive corruption cases I've seen in 20 years of law enforcement." "It's all true, Marshal, every word." Colt leaned back in his chair and studied Jake carefully. "The problem is, the main witnesses are all dead. Burke, his deputies, Tommy Blackwood, Ezra Blackwood, they can't testify to any of this. What I've got is a journal that could have been written by anyone, and the word of a drifter who admits to killing 3 lawmen." Jake felt his heart sink. "You don't believe me?" "I didn't say that, but believing you and proving your story in court are 2 different things." The marshal opened his desk drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. "However, it so happens that we've been investigating Sheriff Burke for several months now. We had reports of unusual gold transactions in Denver and San Francisco, raw nuggets being sold in quantities that didn't match the official production reports from the Cedar Gulch district. Then you know I'm telling the truth. I know Burke was involved in something illegal, but I needed proof, and thanks to you and Tommy Blackwood's journal, now I have it." Marshal Colt stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling street below. "The question now is what to do about it. You're going to arrest Burke's remaining associates, aren't you? Clean up the corruption?" Burke's remaining associates scattered to the wind the moment news of his death reached Cedar Gulch. By the time my man arrived in town, half the people on Tommy's list had disappeared. The ones who stayed are claiming they were coerced, forced to cooperate under threat of violence. Jake felt a surge of anger. So they get away with it? All those miners who were robbed, Tommy and Ezra who were murdered, none of that matters? Marshal Colt turned back to face him. I didn't say they were getting away with it. I said the situation was complicated. He returned to his desk and picked up another document. Based on the evidence you've provided, I'm issuing warrants for the arrest of 12 men involved in Burke's operation. We'll catch them eventually. Men like that can't stay hidden forever. What about the stolen gold? What about it? According to your own testimony, you found it buried on your property. Legally, it belongs to you now. Jake blinked in surprise. But it was stolen from those miners. Proving which specific gold came from which specific claim would be impossible at this point. The miners have been compensated through other means. We've seized Burke's personal assets and distributed them among the victims. The gold you found represents years of accumulated theft. Consider it your reward for bringing this case to justice. The marshal opened another drawer and pulled out a badge. There's something else, Morrison. Cedar Gulch needs a new sheriff, someone who's not connected to the old corruption. The job pays well, and given what you've been through, I think you'd be highly motivated to keep the town honest. Jake stared at the badge, hardly able to process what he was hearing. A week ago, he'd been a broke cowpoke who'd spent his last $50 on worthless land. Now he was looking at enough gold to set him up for life and a job offer that would give him respect and authority. I'm not sure I'm sheriff material, Marshal. You took on 3 armed men and won. You rode 200 miles through dangerous country to make sure evidence reached the right people. You could have kept quiet, taken the gold, and disappeared. Instead, you chose to see justice done. Marshal Colt held out the badge. That's exactly the kind of man we need wearing a star. Jake took the badge and turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it. Not just the physical weight, but the responsibility it represented. What about my land? Keep it. A sheriff needs a place to live, and that property is perfect. Close enough to town to respond to trouble, far enough away to have some privacy. You might even get that well working again now that you know what happened to it. 6 months later, Sheriff Jake Morrison stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching the sunset over his 40 acres of land. The well was flowing again, clear, sweet water that bubbled up from 20 feet down just like it had in the old days. The cabin had been expanded and reinforced, and Jake had built a proper barn for his horses. The gold had been more than enough to pay for the improvements and still leave him with a comfortable nest egg in the bank. But more important than the money was the satisfaction he felt every morning when he pinned on his badge and rode into Cedar Gulch to keep the peace. The town had changed in the months since Burke's death. Honest miners were working claims that had been abandoned, new businesses were opening, and families were moving in to take advantage of the opportunities. There had been some rough patches. A few of Burke's old associates had tried to return and resume their criminal activities, but Jake had dealt with them swiftly and decisively. The people of Cedar Gulch respected their new sheriff, partly because he'd cleaned up the corruption, but mostly because he treated everyone fairly. Rich or poor, miner or merchant, everyone got equal treatment under Sheriff Morrison's watch. As Jake stood watching the sunset, he heard hoofbeats approaching from the east. A familiar figure rode into his yard, and Jake smiled as Sarah Whitman dismounted near his porch. "Evening, Sheriff," she said, returning his smile. "How's the well working?" "Like a charm. Best water in the territory, just like you said." Jake gestured toward 2 chairs he'd placed on the porch. "Care to sit a spell? I've got fresh coffee on the stove." Sarah tied her horse to the hitching post Jake had installed and joined him on the porch. "I heard you arrested those claim jumpers who were working the Hendricks mine." They weren't claim jumpers exactly. They had papers that looked legal enough to fool most folks, but when I checked with the territorial office, turned out those papers were forgeries. The Hendricks family still owns that claim, fair and square. You're getting quite a reputation as a sheriff who does his homework. Jake poured coffee for both of them and settled into his chair. Tommy Blackwood taught me the importance of keeping good records and checking facts. Shame I never got to meet him. Sounds like he was a good man. He was, and his father was too, despite what people thought toward the end. Ezra was just trying to protect what his son had died for. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out over the desert. It was a peaceful scene, the kind Jake had dreamed about during all those years of working other men's cattle and sleeping under other men's stars. "You know," Sarah said eventually, "there's something I never told you about the day I rode over here to warn you about the land." "What's that?" "I knew you were going to find something. Call it intuition, call it woman's instincts, but I could tell you were the kind of man who'd dig until he found answers. That's why I really came over here. Not to warn you away from the land, but to make sure you were the right kind of person to find what Ezra had hidden." Jake looked at her in surprise. "You knew there was something buried here?" "I suspected. Ezra used to come over to my place sometimes, when he needed to talk to someone. He never told me exactly what he'd found or where he'd put it, but he made it clear that someday the right person would come along and finish what Tommy had started." "And you thought I was that person?" Sarah smiled, and in the lamplight from the cabin, Jake could see warmth in her sage-green eyes. A man who'd spend his last $50 on a piece of land everyone else said was worthless? A man who'd work from dawn to dusk trying to make something out of nothing? "Yes, I thought you might be exactly the right person." Jake felt something stir in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee and everything to do with the woman sitting beside him. "Sarah, Sheriff Morrison." The call came from the direction of town, where Jake could see a rider approaching at full gallop. "Sheriff, we need you in town." Jake stood and reached for his gun belt. "What's the trouble, Billy?" The young man pulled his horse to a stop near the porch, breathing hard from the ride. "It's the Carver gang, Sheriff. They hit the bank just before closing time, made off with maybe $2,000, and shot Mr. Peterson when he tried to stop them." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with danger and responsibility. "How bad is Peterson hurt?" "Doc says he'll live, but it was close. The gang headed north toward Devil's Canyon. Figured they'd hole up there until things cooled down." "How many of them?" 4, maybe 5. They were masked, but folks think it was Frank Carver and his boys. They've been hitting banks all through the territory." Jake buckled on his gun belt and headed for the barn to saddle his horse. Sarah followed him, her expression serious. "Devil's Canyon is treacherous country," she said. "Easy for a man to get ambushed up there if he's not careful. I know the risks." Jake threw a saddle over his horse's back and began tightening the cinch. "But that's what they pay me for. Want some help? I know those canyons as well as anyone." Jake paused in his preparations. "This is dangerous work, Sarah. These men have already shot one person tonight, and they'll shoot more if they're not stopped. Besides, you might need someone who knows the back trails." She smiled, but there was steel in her voice. "I can take care of myself, Sheriff." Jake looked into her eyes and saw the same determination he'd felt that morning when he'd first stood on his property and decided to make something of himself. Sarah Whitman was offering to risk her life to help him do his job, and that meant more to him than all the gold in Ezra's treasure box. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this my way. I'm the sheriff, you're a deputy. You follow my orders, no arguments." Sarah nodded. "Understood." As they rode toward Devil's Canyon under a canopy of desert stars, Jake Morrison reflected on how much his life had changed in just 6 months. He'd started as a broke drifter with nothing but hope and $50 to his name. Now he was a respected lawman with property, money in the bank, and a woman beside him who was willing to face danger to help him protect their community. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was better than anything he could have imagined. And as they rode into the night to face whatever dangers waited in Devil's Canyon, Jake knew that whatever happened, he'd found something worth fighting for. The 40 acres of worthless land had given him more than just gold. It had given him purpose, respect, and the chance to make a real difference in the world. Sometimes, Jake thought, the most valuable treasures are the ones you have to fight to keep.